He already knows what is ahead and what holds tomorrow or what happens tomorrow. Well, the last few months have been some challenges. I don't know about you, but I was telling someone this past week. I'm over this COVID. I am over it. Now, that's my job, y'all. You understand that. But I'm over it. I've also decided I'm over this election. I'm over all the news. It seems like every time I open up the internet or I get onto Facebook or I get onto something, it's just all this news, and I start feeling myself start maybe a little bit hyperventilating. Is anyone else like that a little bit? I mean, you start thinking, oh my, what else is going to happen? What else is going to happen? What about this? What about that? I'm glad that God is big enough this morning, and He's got everything under control. And this morning, I was thinking about a song that we used to sing with the kids, and with the kids that said, "My God is so big, so strong and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do." You know, this morning, I think it would do us all good to pay attention to that song as adults. But let me ask you a question this morning. How big is God? Have you ever given that any thought? Have you ever considered it? One little boy was one day sitting there drawing, and his father walked up behind him and said, "Son, what are you doing?" He says, "Daddy, I'm drawing a picture of God." And his daddy looked at him and said, "Son, you can't do that because no one knows what God looks like." The little boy thought for a minute, then he looked up at his daddy and says, "When I get done, they'll know what he looks like." But this morning, I'd ask you, how big is the God that you serve? This morning, we are going to be looking over in 1 Kings chapter 17. And we're going to be breaking into this story just a little bit. But here, a famine has struck the land. A 3-year drought is on the land as a result of the people's idolatry. For some time, Elijah has been hanging out and living near the brook of Cherith, being provided by God. But because of the lack of rain, the brook dries up and Elijah is called to move on. And we pick up the story there as Elijah, a man with a great big God, meets a widow whose God is about to get a whole lot bigger herself. And starting with chapter 17 and verse 8, we read these words. "Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you.' So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, 'Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink.' And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, 'Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand.' And she said, 'As the Lord your God lives.'" Wow. "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked but only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And she went and did as Elijah said. And she and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. And again this morning, I'd ask you, how big is your God this morning? Is your God the size of maybe the widow's, or do you have the God of Elijah this morning? You know, it has been said that the problem with us nowadays is that our God is too small. A.W. Tozer wrote that, "I am positively sure after many years of observation and prayer that the basis of all our trouble today in the religious circles is that our God is too small. The truth is that for most of us, our God is too small. Now understand that I don't mean that God is actually small or that God is actually limited. What I mean is that we see him as being too small. We begin to put constraints and limitations on what we think God can do. Now, I realize that we don't say it out loud, but sometimes we don't have the faith to believe in a great big God. The kind of looking through the wrong end of a binoculars. Have you ever done that as a kid? Picked up a binoculars and thought, wow, look at those things, how small they are, just to realize you have them backwards. Oh, some of you are kind of giggling. I see y'all have done that. But he says to us, the problem is that we see him too small. We don't really understand his greatness and the power that he can help us. Here are a few things that happen to us when our God is too small. Okay, this is what happens to us when our God is too small. First of all, friends, now think of the day and age we live in. When our God is too small, we live in fear and anxiety. Worry dominates the life of those whose God is too small. Because if God is small, then really what we are saying and what we are thinking is that it suddenly all depends upon me. I've got to handle the situation. How bright you are, how good you are, how pretty you are, how effective you are, how strong you are, how talented you are, how much you have. You see, if our God is too small, then it all depends upon me. If your God is small, then you have to take care of it. All over the world, there are people this morning serving small gods. Can I tell you that? They have to, I even know of some people that have gods that are so small, they've got to even serve their God. They got to feed their God. I was thinking a number of years ago, I was in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii. And this is the island that is known for volcanoes. And we were driving there in what they call Volcano National Park, and I can remember seeing things along this side of the road. And I asked the tour guide, said, what in the world? That looks like food. That looks like alcohol. That looks like presents and balloons and things like that on the side. They said, oh, those are gifts to the goddess Pele. People need to bring her gifts to keep her happy, to feed her. My friends, you know, if we are not careful, sometimes we start worshiping a God that is so small that we think we have to almost take care of him. Always worry, anxiety, fear dominates the life of those whose God is too small. You know, I'm going to admit something, as I said earlier. Recently, as I have been watching the news and paying attention and looking at what is happening on the internet, I see all the news and what's going on in the polls, and I think to myself, how's this going to turn out? What's going to happen if this election goes one way or the other? And I find myself almost a little bit getting really anxious. But this week I've been reminded once again, it doesn't matter what happens with this election, friends. Can I tell you that? It really doesn't matter because God is bigger than any political election that happens here in the United States. I got thinking about the COVID virus, and can I tell you this morning that it doesn't matter what happens with COVID, because you know what? My God is bigger than any COVID. I think of that course. God's still running this world. God's still running this world. Satan thought he could, but God said he would never could. God's still running this world. My friend, what kind of God are you serving? When we are serving too small of a God, we become overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. But when we are serving too small of a God, my friend, we often become defensive also. When our God is too small, we have feelings that any attack might overwhelm our logic. Any question, any doubt might break what I believe into tatters. The truth is that many, if not most Christians today, live in a Christian bubble that they are always fearful will shatter in pieces around them. My friends, When our God is too small, we become very defensive. When our God is too small, we become very stingy. We cannot give generously. If we believe that our financial security and our well-being depends upon us, we cannot give because we don't believe that we're going to have enough. This is one of the reasons why some people don't tithe. I won't have enough. The truth is that if you don't tithe, there will never be enough, my friends. That when our God is too small, that not only do we become anxious and fearful, not only do we become defensive and stingy, but we also oftentimes become demanding. Demanding. We have to have it our way. You see, if our God is too small, we cannot see and appreciate that in Christ there is great diversity. Now, I am not talking about biblical doctrine that we can all believe what we want to believe, friends. But do you realize that even in the church we can have diversity? But when our God becomes so small, it has to be my way. And I can't see anyone else's view. My God possibly can't be the God of that. You know, I was thinking and I was reading how that a majority of the arguments in the church over worship styles stem from this very thought. Our God isn't big enough. We feel that there is only one way to approach him, that it is my way. And so I've heard, and thankfully I've not heard it in this church, but I have heard it in other churches where we have to sing only hymns, or other people say we only have to sing choruses. That God is only, can I tell you something? God is great enough. That you know, sometimes our God gets small and we worship the method instead of the God. I think of when we went down to Guatemala here the last couple of years, and we sat there in that service, and we listened to those people as they worshiped. Their worship is totally different than us here, wasn't it, Sister Bobby? It's way different. I mean, one way that they worship is that the men sat on one side and the women sat on the other side. Okay? Husbands and wives didn't sit together. Maybe that was good. Their music, they had drums, they had bass guitars, they had pianos that had all kinds of musical instruments I've never heard before. But they get every one of those instruments on that electric keyboard going. And those people are standing and they're worshiping. And it's things that you and I probably are not comfortable with, and maybe we wouldn't be used to in a worship service. But can I tell you, I am thankful standing there in the midst of a hot, sweaty church service that an almighty God could meet down with those people. And here in Frankfort, Indiana, there's a same great big God that can meet with us in all of our own traditions. You see, God is big enough. We have to be careful that when our God begins to get too small, that we begin to get very demanding. It has to be a certain way. Too often our God is so small that this is only the way I see it, the only way I like it, the only way that I am used to it. Friends, when we serve a small God, we truly become demanding. That many of our arguments and the things we want to fight about is all because our God is too small. So, the question is this morning, how big is God? I think one of the best places to look is over in the book of Job, chapter 38. And you don't have to turn there, but let me just read some of it. And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he said, "Who is this that darkness counsels by words without knowledge, dressed for action like a man? I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garments, and thick darkness its swaddling bands, and prescribed limits to it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no further. And here shall your proud waves be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know it? Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked into the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of the deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know it. Have you entered the storehouse of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of hell, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? Can you establish the rule of the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth the lightning that may go and say to you, here we are? The truth is, folks, that God is bigger than you and I can imagine. And yet he is small enough to fit in your heart. He is big enough to answer every need and small enough to hear your whispered prayer. He is big enough to encompass the universe in a thought and small enough to number the hairs of your head. How big, my friend, is your God? Paul said, I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted him unto that day. Friends, our God, he is bigger than you'll ever need him to be. But it is important this morning that we learn about the greatness and how big our God is. Let's look together at this passage in the 1 Kings and see what we can learn about expanding our vision of a great, big God. This woman starts her day fearful, vulnerable, and despairing that she was preparing her very last meal and then die. But she ends it all learning how great and how big God was. You know, the important thing, friend, is that we be willing to learn about God and his greatness. How do we learn how big God is? There's three things. The first thing that we've got to do is we've got to be willing to change our focus. Now think about it. Notice what Elijah tells this woman to do. He told her to make a small cake for me first, then to make one for you and your son. If you want to learn how big God is, we need to begin to focus on others. We have become an egocentric society looking out for number one. The truth is that an inwardly focused life never understands how big God is. The life, the church, the vision, that only sees its own needs doesn't understand and cannot begin to understand how big God is. God has a vision for his people. He is not limited by denomination. He is not limited by race. He is not limited by methodology. He is not limited by political opinions. My friends, God's greater than all of that. God's vision for you is that not that you just simply survive. You know what God's vision is for you? God's vision for you is that you thrive and become a part of his plan. But for us to be part of his plan, we've got to change our focus. We've got to begin to look out from ourselves and out unto others. Look around this week. See what you can do. Is there someone with a greater need than you yourself this week? When you start feeling sorry and you start feeling overwhelmed in your own life, look out. Find someone. Reach out to them. Send a text. Call them. Send a note. Do something for someone else. Friends, we start looking and changing our focus, we'll start seeing how great God really is. No matter how little you are or how little you have, God is big enough to make you part of that plan. But it starts when you begin, as the Apostle Paul says, to see others as more important than yourself. But not only do we need to change our focus, we need to step out in faith. What do you think that greatest worry or fear of that woman was that day? Thinking, being a parent, I can't imagine having just enough to feed your child and thinking, having a stranger come up and say, feed me first. Friends, That takes a whole lot of faith. But he asked this with a promise. If you step out in faith, God will reward you. If you step out and confront your fears, God has promised that he will always provide. Fear is the reason why people don't try. Fear is one reason why many people don't tithe. Fear is the reason why people don't witness. Fear is the reason why people don't give and why people don't work and why people don't try. Fear of failure, fear of the future, fear that they won't have enough. Can I tell you that fear is a killer of faith? Friend, in this day we are living, we need a fresh vision of God and his greatness. I think of everything that's going on, and we need to see God. We need to step out in this day with a new faith and a new boldness that God has promised that he would never fail us, he would never forsake us, but he has promised that he would take care of us. You can take hold of that. Peter had to do it when God called and said, Peter, come on, step out of that boat. You want to experience me? And Peter, step out of the boat, come on. And when Jesus said to the woman, take that little bit of flour, a little bit of oil, come on, make me a cake. You know what God is saying to us this morning? I'm not sure what he's saying to you, but I believe that he's speaking to a lot of this morning. There's some of you that are facing some big things, some maybe impossible things in your life, and you're wondering, how in the world? I could never do that. But can I tell you something this morning? God's saying, don't look at a little God, look at me. I want you to step out, and I want you to have faith that I'll get you through. Come on, he said, step out of that boat. Come on and take what little means you have and make me a cake. Come on, let's step out in faith this morning and see the greatness of our God. The third thing that I notice, if we're going to see the greatness of God, is that we're going to have to just rest in him day by day. The truth is that many people don't really want to walk by faith. They want to walk by sight. And can I tell you, we're all human. If you were to blindfold me, some of you all would blindfold me and say, follow me. Just trust me, Brother Gene. Just trust me. You know, this week, our small group went up to Exploration Acres. And we went into the corn maze. You know, that's a lot like life. And at one point, John Huffer was out front trying to lead us. How many of y'all would like to follow John Huffer through a corn maze and have him get you out? Some of the time, well, we bypassed John and went around him. And Matt was leading us. Well, it was a lot like following John Huffer at times. You want me to tell you the best person if you have to get a corn maze with? That's Nairi Huffer. Get in there with Nairi Huffer. She can get you and find your way around. But you know what? In life, sometimes we just need to trust and rest in God. We can't walk by sight sometimes. We just have to walk by faith. If I have it, I'll give it. If I have time, I'll invest it. You know, one of the great things about the story that I have oftentimes overlooked in the story was the story, part of the story, this widow just didn't have enough to make Elijah and her son and herself enough for the moment. She had enough to sustain her. Notice that this woman is not given an abundance. We would think, okay, she took the little bit. Now God should fill that oil container all the way up, right, Brother Seth? Or that flour container should be filled all the way up. No. It wasn't. Imagine the experience of using the last cup of oil only to find at the next meal another cup was in the jar. Never a gallon, never even a quart, just enough. Each time she needed it, there was just enough. What is it that you need God this morning to do? Can I tell you, He's going to give you just enough. And sometimes we need to just to live in God, in the greatness of God, day by day, and just rest in Him, that He has promised He would never fail us, He would never forsake us. Sometimes faith is like that, asking us simply just to trust that what we don't see will happen. Now, don't tell me you can't do this, because you guys do it every day. Think about that every time you walk up to that light switch. Now, y'all don't worry, is the light going to come on? Unless you haven't paid your bill, you might be worried. But for the most part, we walk up to that light switch. We don't know, but in our hearts we know I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to flip it and it's going to turn on and there's going to be lights. Why is it hard for us to believe in a great big God that created you and all this mighty universe, that He won't provide and to meet and to help you this morning? And that every day, all you have to do is just take the step forward. I'm going to trust you today, Lord. I know that today you will provide. I may not see it. I may not understand it. I may not know how, but Lord, you have promised me. And so day by day, as we just live day by day, we will begin to see the greatness of God. In conclusion, this morning, I'm not sure what you're going through. I don't know what you're facing. I know that in this day of uncertainty, we all live with a lot of fear and anxiety, a lot of uncertainty. But this morning, we serve a great big God. There is a story that is told of a boy who asked his daddy, "Dad, what is the size of God? How big is God, Daddy?" His father looked up at the sky, and his father saw a plane in the far distance. And he asked his son, "Son, before I answer your question, I want you to look up at that plane up there. And you tell me, what is the size of that plane?" The boy looked at that plane. "Well, Daddy, it's so far away. It's so small." His father said, "Son, we're going to take a little trip." And that father and that son got into the daddy's truck, and he took him down to the local airport. And as they pulled up, the little boy's eyes became big as he saw those jumbo jets there. And his dad said, "Now, son, how big is that plane?" And the boy looked at the airplane and he says, "Wow, Dad, that plane is huge. It's a lot bigger than the plane that I saw in the sky, isn't it?" And the father put his arms around his son and he said, "Son, God is a lot like this plane. You see, it's the same plane you saw in the sky from a distance. It looks so small. You see, God's size depends on how close or how far you are from Him. The closer you are, the bigger God is." And this morning, my friends, maybe this morning your God looks like a small God. And maybe the problems of life look impossible. I'd encourage you this morning just to draw closer to God. Because the closer you get to God, the more you'll begin to see how big, how great our God really is. I've asked Brother Seth and Heidi to lead us this morning in that song. And I'd like to invite you to stand with us and sing. How great is our God? How great is your God? How big is the God that you are serving this morning? My friend, let's change our focus. Let's step out in faith this morning and believe Him, and then just rest in Him day by day. Brother Seth,
the splendor of